What happened next was slightly terrifying. I couldn't see exactly what was going on until I moved the router out of the way. I'm Brad. Welcome to DIY Wouldn't You? In this video, we're gonna build this gigantic end grain cutting board. Mercy, this thing's heavy. My buddy asked me if I would make this for him, who's my preacher also. It scared the snot out of me. I'd never made an end grain cutting board before. I had seen what goes into it. There are some nuances that make this a really difficult project unless you have the right tools. So anyway, let's jump into the project. Time out real quick. Before we get any further, let me explain what an end grain cutting board is, in case anybody doesn't know. Here's the wood that we're using, this black walnut. Now, I would call this the face grain. I'm not sure if that's the correct term or not, but anyway, I would call this the edge grain, and then this the end grain. Here's a couple examples of the different kinds of cutting boards. This is going to be an edge grain. So you're seeing multiple boards with this edge. This I would call a face grain. This is actually a charcuterie board with live edge on both sides. And then this small board here is an end grain cutting board. You're actually seeing the face grain here, the edge grain here, and the end grain facing up. So the top of the cutting board is actually going to be the end grain of these boards. This surface right here. And just for reference, that end grain is the hardest part of the entire wood. So it makes a really hard, really strong cutting board. Also, very hard to plane and sand. Anyway, let's get back to it. Being that this is the first end grain cutting board that I've ever made, scares me a little bit. And so I wanted to minimize the amount of risk that's involved. I purchased some wood from a place in Texas on Etsy called Scent in Time. S-C-E-N-T in Time. I'll put a link to their Etsy page in the description below the video. And this wood is, it's beautiful. It's black walnut, and the grade of wood is S2S, which means that two sides are true to each other. The wood has been planed. I got 6 pieces of this, 1 inch by 5 inch by 4 feet long. So the reason that I went with purchased wood from a place in Texas rather than using my own wood is because this is a good base to start with. These boards are nice and true, the edges made up nicely. I am gonna have to plane these down thickness wise, but this is a great starting point. It saves me a lot of time. The cost of the wood up front is worth the time that I would spend preparing my own pieces of wood to get them to this point, if that makes sense. Now, some of these boards did have a little bit of a curve to them. Thankfully, my neighbor has a joiner, and so we ran these through the joiner. So I'm going to run these through the table saw real quick just to shave them down and make sure that they're all the same width and they're all square. And then I'm going to plane them down to the same thickness and then glue them up. Now, while I was truing these up on the table saw, I went ahead and cut this last board to the optimal width. The reason I did that, this board is going to be 24 inches wide, and I wanted to alternate the seams to give it a cool offset look when you're looking down the board. So I cut this board slightly narrower than the rest, and then after I cut my strips, I can alternate flipping the seams back and forth, and hopefully that'll work out pretty good. I'm going to go ahead and take my DIY Wouldn't You sweatshirt off so that I don't get glue on it and mess it up. Speaking of DIY Wouldn't You, here at DIY Wouldn't You, we want to inspire and educate. We want to make projects entertaining and encourage you to try something fun, learn something new, and impress yourself and your friends. We want to remind you that just because you haven't done something, it doesn't mean you can't. So keep learning, keep building, keep DIYing. Alright, here's the glue up. What I'm going to do here is stand each board up on its end, all facing the same direction, and all except for that last board down there. And that's because we glue all these edges. That one doesn't need to be glued because it's already glued with this one. That was confusing, huh? For this end grain board, I'm using Type Bond 3. Now this is a waterproof and food grade glue. Excuse me. So it's going to be safe to use on a cutting board, especially since this cutting board's from my preacher. Did I mention that? I'm a little bit nervous about this. Glued up. I'm wiping down the excess glue on the seams That way, once it dried, it'll be easier to get the rest of it off. There won't be so much to get off. This has been sitting here for 2 days now with the clamps on it. I've got 2 pipe clamps, 2 bar clamps, clamps with boards and angles on the ends to hold it perfectly flat and square. Let's unclamp it and take a look. Check this out. The edges you can feel just a little bit. So I'm gonna buzz over it one time with some 80 grit and then go ahead and cut this into strips for the main glue up. Now the next step is to cut this large glued up piece of wood into 2-inch strips. Now I tried at first using my table saw, which scares the snot out of me and ended in disaster actually, as you can see here. So I switched to an alternative method of using a straight edge and my circular saw, which took a little bit of time but actually worked very well.
Ice in my veins, I've been driving this train. Years in this lane, there's no stopping this flame. Cause I came to the game and I changed it to play how I like, rearranged it to my own domain. Yeah, I got what it takes, made lots of mistakes, taking shots, skipping breaks, feeling lost, feeling great, popping off, singing straight, never stop.
Alright, I cut 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20. 20 pieces to get it almost 18 inches. I've staggered the seams and I think that looks pretty stinking sweet. So now I'll glue it up, clamp it up, try to square it up the best I can.
Here to play and I've got something to say, yeah. I work hard each and every day. I get lost in the words I say. I don't push pause, no I push play. I won't stop till I make a change. I withdraw on the things I make. I turn flaws into flawless traits. I build tall, never capped in space. I won't stop till I hear him say, and I'm up again. I got tired eyes, need a cup of blend.
I guess there's got to be a first time for everything. Here we go. Alright, now I have clamped the ever-living snot out of this thing. Clamps, 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 clamps. If I had more clamps, I'd put them on here. I'm gonna let this sit for a day, maybe more, and then we'll unclamp it and carry on. Now that I've sanded that down, I'm going to use a surfacing bit. This is a 1.25 inch diameter for a 1/4 inch shank router. See how it does on this. Alright, there's side one. Now something that I forgot about until after the fact was to use a sacrificial piece of wood on either side when clamping this up to glue. The reason that you do that is because when you're clamping this down, the outer pieces of wood here can actually bow where you've got your clamps. So where I had pipe clamps here, I was able to get more force on those pipe clamps than across the rest of the board. So there was actually a little bit of wave on these end boards here. I was able to run the edge of the board through a joiner and true it up a little bit. But now I'm going to use some Starbond, which this video is not sponsored by. Starbond, if you'd like to sponsor a video, please reach out. My email is in the description. I'm going to use some Starbond and put glue in a couple of these little voids here and then get to sanding on this. What the Starbond is basically just super glue, but you spray an activator on it and it makes it dry within a few seconds so that you can go back and sand right away. Next, I switched to my belt sander and 40 grit sandpaper to cut down on each side. It took about 30 minutes to start smoothing this board out. After that, I switched to a palm sander and used 80 grit, 120, 220, and 320 to finish this board out. It took a really long time, but it finished out nice and smooth. Before I go any further, I'm going to go ahead and true up this edge and this edge. Now I've got to figure out how to get a juice groove in this. Now for that juice groove, I'm going to be using one of these Yoniko round nose bits. And I'm going to be using a 3/4 inch. And I think I want to put it about an inch in from the outside. The way that I'm going to approach this is I've spaced some boards here and I've got a straight edge to use to go across. I don't have enough wood. It would take me a long time to set it up all the way around. So what I'm going to do is just measure a little bit over an inch from each edge, mark it so that I don't route past that, and then do each side one at a time. Now before I adjust, I'm going to drop the bit down to cut deeper. What happened next was slightly terrifying. I was buzzing along, routing the juice groove, and I noticed it was getting chattery and it was fighting me a lot. And I couldn't see exactly what was going on until I moved the router out of the way, and what that was the bit was actually walking down out of the chuck and digging down further into the wood. Deep into the wood. Turned the router off, tried to tighten the chuck down, tried to go again, and it did the same thing. So I turned the camera off, closed the shed up, put everything away, and walked away. Came back the next day, sat, looked at it, and I realized something about when I've watched people make these boards before. What I was doing was trying to do about a 3/16 pass. And that's way too much meat when you're going across the end grain. And so I started doing 16th inch passes, just slowly working my way down. The juice groove was a little bit deeper than I wanted. It ended up about 3/4. I wanted it about a 1/2 inch or 5/8. But I was able to clean it up and salvage what I was doing. Took a little bit more work sanding. I'm glad I just walked away and then came back later. That's an important lesson. Sometimes we just need to do that. Just take a breather, walk away, because you're frustrated. And when you're frustrated, it's hard to think about stuff. This method worked fine for this cutting board, however it did take a long time. So before I do another board with a juice groove, I will set up a jig. That way I can route all the way around on all 4 sides, and the only thing I have to adjust is the depth of the bit. Yeah. What my buddy wants in this board is a juice groove all the way around, and then a not quite as deep drain slot in one of the corners here. I don't know specifically that he wants that, but the board that he showed me that he wanted had that. So I'm going to do it here. I think for this, I'm going to drop it down one more time and then let that be it. I think we're going to call that good. Let me show you what I got. Ice in my veins, I've been driving this train. Now to get these straight edges, I took these 2 pieces of wood and used my carpenter's square. Put them at a 45. That way I know for sure that it is coming straight out from the corner. No stopping this flame, cause I came to the game and I changed it to play. How I like rearranged it to my own. I'm going to route hand grooves in the bottom here. Taking shots, skipping breaks, feeling lost, feeling great. Popping off, singing straight, never stopped, never changed. All the squad here to play and I've got something to say. So now to get these hand grips, I'm going to be using a 1/2 inch cove bit with a bearing. That way it'll be nice and consistent. No, I push play. I won't stop till I make a change. I withdraw on the things I make.
I turn flaws into flawless traits. I build small, never got in space.
Pretty happy with how this turned out. Alright, so there's the handholds. Here's the pour spout for the juice groove. Now I just need to route these edges, clean up this groove, finish sand, and seal this thing. I'm going to route all the edges using just a chamfered or a 45-degree router bit. And I'm going to make it kind of small.
I won't stop till I hear him say, 6 a.m.
Now, being that this cutting board is for my preacher, I thought maybe it'd be suitable to engrave a Bible verse in it. So I reached out to his wife and asked if there was a specific Bible verse that he wanted engraved in it. She told me to do Jeremiah 17 verses 7 and 8. And that passage says this: "But blessed is the one who trusts in the Lord, whose confidence is in him. They will be like a tree planted by the water, that sends out its roots by the stream. It does not fear when heat comes. Its leaves are always green. It has no worries in a year of drought, and never fails to bear fruit." When hard times come, when the world's unstable, when we don't know what tomorrow brings, we can have our faith planted in Christ and know that He's got us. And whatever happens, it's going to be fine. Maybe somebody needs to hear this verse right now. Also, I think I'm going to engrave my logo in the bottom of this board because why not? All right, here goes nothing. That turned out fantastic. I've got the engraving done, got my logo on there. This is sanded to 220. So I'm going to spray it down with water and raise the grain. And then I'll come back tomorrow, do a finish sand, and then oil this. After this dried, after I raised the grain, I went back and sanded this again with 220. So now what I'm going to do is coat the entire thing in white mineral oil, let it soak in, and sit overnight. I've heard with end grain, it could take anywhere from 1 to 3 coats of the mineral oil, and then I'm going to go back and coat this with a cutting board wax. So we'll see how fast this soaks in, how many coats it takes. I've gone around and done 2 solid coats on this whole thing of the mineral oil, and it is indeed soaking right in. I'm going to let it sit overnight and come back tomorrow and carry on with the cutting board wax. Last step before this board is done. This sat overnight. I'm going to go ahead and wipe it down with this rag, get any excess wax off, which I don't think there'll be much. It feels like most of it's soaked on in there. There she is. I was super nervous about making this board, being that it was the first end grain cutting board I had ever made. But my friend had confidence in me, and so I'm thankful for that. I hope he loves it. Happy birthday, Ryan. Hope you enjoy this thing. I hope it's good to you for many years to come. If you enjoyed this video, or if it was helpful at all, give it a thumbs up. If you want to see more fun projects that we're working on, subscribe to the channel. We'd love to see you back. If you want to be the first to know when we post another video, hit the notification bell. I'm Brad, this is DIY Woodn't You. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time. I didn't want to build this. I really didn't.
But I'm sure I'm glad that I did, because it turned out sweet.
Have I mentioned yet that I'm very nervous about this because this is the first ingrain cutting board that I've done, and it's for my preacher? If I haven't mentioned that yet, it's true.